right. So this pair of articles, I believe it's the intro and end chapter of a book. What I think it's Trottier. What he's talking about is this idea of stigma, the idea that how stigma works in real life and online. And it's a nice little article in some respects because though I think, and we'll talk about this, it's a little bit dated regarding some of how social media has developed in the last few years. It's interesting because it's going to point us towards some other things that we're going to talk about starting next week. Especially next week, there's this very brief little Plato reading that I have that I'm probably going to refer to often, for some time in the future for the rest of the semester. So this article kind of gets to some of those issues. And what I want to do is take some of his ideas or some of his examples, et cetera, and kind of tie them to some stuff that's, a little bit more recent. And here we go with this button. Okay. So the basic idea here is he's talking about digital stigma, and I'll just use this quote to talk about what he basically means by that. When sensitive personal details are made public through online platforms, resulting in negative affect, a compromised reputation, and persistent discrimination. So lots of different things can come from this concept or this idea or this phenomenon of digital stigma. How does this relate to issues about the self, which is kind of what we're talking about? Well, there's this guy, Solov, who says our reputations are a key dimension of our self and part of the core of our identity. So these are some issues that we've been sort of introducing since, I think, Turkle, but even, before that with Frankenstein. So in connection to some of these previous discussions, note here that reputations, of course, can change. Is this perhaps exacerbated by the use of social media, the use of smartphones, et cetera? But if reputations can change, and according to Solov, they're sort of the core to our identity, this does suggest that identity or personal identity, the self, et cetera, how we view ourselves is somewhat malleable, right? How much is it malleable? Is there still, even though it can change in various respects, a sort of fixed core? These are other issues that you might want to think about in relation to online identities. So the key issue here, in what sense is, for example, uploading your personal information? That can be anything from pictures, even the comments that you make on, say, a news story, for example. Different facts about yourself, the profile that you make, the things that you include, the things that you exclude, et cetera. In what sense is uploading all of that to some sort of medium contributory to digital stigma? And I think that, of course, obviously, it is contributory. It does contribute to digital stigmas if they happen to occur. The deeper issue, I think, that Trottier doesn't really get at, because I don't think that social media had developed in 2014 when he was writing this article to the point where this became a huge issue. The bigger issue then is how are we dealing with that? How is society changing and dealing with, or maybe even absorbing, some of these problems about digital stigma? And that's an interesting sort of case study that we'll look at towards the end. All right, so let's just talk about some of the issues here, issues about online use and different stigmas that come along with it. So Trottier says, digital stigma is a product of digital media culture. Okay, fair enough. As people use platforms like Facebook to share personal information. 2014, Facebook, of course, was the big game in town. There's a lot more ways of engaging socially on online formats. To be clear, he says the social impact and relevance of digital media is linked to users' behaviors on sites like Facebook and less with the algorithms and hardware that make up these services. So again, he's writing in 2014, and I think that perhaps this outlook or this view may be a little bit dated. And in fact, Trottier, in different places in these two articles or these two chapters, sort of does kind of pull back from that a little bit, as we'll see, I think. So two issues that we can think about, though, from this quote. The concept of content from the user on the one hand, and of course, that is going to be the medium through which these social media platforms essentially gain access to us and our engagement with others. The whole web of engagement comes through what you put up there. Secondly, the concept of the algorithm's impact on social interaction. So these are two different things. One of them, the first one, the concept of content from the user, I believe that that's more or less a new thing when we're talking about telecommunications technologies, right? So for example, in the 50s, you watched TV. The information you got from TV was entirely a one-way street. Now, your local TV station has a Facebook page, right? And they post news stories just like they always would. But guess what happens now? People go in and they interact with these news stories. They comment on them. Sometimes the news channels comment back. And you get this whole melange of chaos, basically. People, it's the equivalent, the 21st century equivalent of throwing your shoe at the TV, like you might have done in the 50s. But guess what? You're not going to impact the person on the screen. You are now, or you have the potential to do that now. So it's a new thing, the idea that social media is in this way, sort of two-way, and it's again through the content. So let's talk about that a little bit. So part of Facebook's success, as Trottier notes, comes from what the users generate themselves. The whole point of Facebook is, of course, for users to put stuff up on the platform, to create an account, to embellish that account by putting pictures up, by putting stories up, by putting stuff on your, what is it called these days, the news feed, and of course engaging with other people's pictures, other people's news feeds, other people's posts. So it can come in any one of these kinds of ways of engaging through Facebook, right? Pictures, comments, anytime you like something, that's also considered engagement, interactions of any sort, even how long you look at a picture. Of course, the new thing in the last several years is advertisements on Facebook. I read somewhere that the advertisement issue actually started in 2007, which is only 3 years after the very initial launch of Facebook. The very small launch of Facebook. But of course, that was a long time ago. It was very much in its infancy. It's just become a completely different thing by 2021. So a key problem here is, or a key issue, Facebook is a medium for putting your own content on social display. But what you choose to put up and how you engage with what other people put up, that's the data that Facebook uses to essentially create their own profile of you. They can, and this is important for their own sort of advertisement side of things, right? From the pictures that you put up, from the comments that you make, from the likes that you put, that you click on, from how long you're engaging with different images, et cetera, they create a version of you that they basically package up according to these algorithms, et cetera, and they can sell that to, say, political organizations who want to use targeted advertising. They're guessing basically what kind of person you are from the stuff that you do through the platform itself. So just a couple of fairly obvious examples, right? Uploading photos allows other people to engage with them. And this engagement is at least part of what Facebook stores in its computers to create you. But it's also, of course, creating others. As I mentioned last time, you can maybe even think of Facebook as a whole as just this gigantic, sort of chaotic, contradictory mess of a person, right? Is Facebook sort of this super complex Frankenstein's monster, right? All the parts would be all the users and all of their information and all of their activity. Comments on various posts, this is the same thing. They use all of this stuff. So this, again, is part of this new element, the fact that you actually are allowed now to engage in telecommunications technology. That's just a very broad term for any sort of electronic communications technology. The difference now is that you have some input. You have some, I hesitate to use the word control, but you do, right? You do have some control. You can talk back to your TV now, in a sense. And it's through this content that you're doing so, right? Facebook is using your actual content as the medium through which to process all of this, what they call engagement. And Mark Zuckerberg is quite clear about this. Mark Zuckerberg is quite clear that the whole point of Facebook at this point is increasing this kind of engagement. And one of the reasons why he wants to increase this kind of engagement is so that he can just get more and more data about you and about everybody as a whole, right? So from this process, and you can think of it as a process of data collection, Facebook has its own version of you. It's interesting because at the surface level, obviously, and this is how it started, I've mentioned a few times that probably Mark Zuckerberg didn't have it in his mind when he started Facebook, all of the stuff that's happening right now. But nevertheless, as a product that people like me and you use, it's still sort of this surface level. Look at me, I can, talk to my friend from high school that I haven't talked to in years, or this is a good way to chat with my cousins who live across, on the other coast or something like that. For us, it is this kind of engagement at a surface level. But for Facebook, the real deal here is getting you to do more of that so they can collect data. And again, kind of create this computerized Facebook version of you. It uses all this, of course, to target you for more engagement. So if you're doing certain kind of things on Facebook, i.e. a certain kind of engagement, Facebook will read that and then target certain other things to you for more engagement. I think one of the big stories lately is that, and this is at least part of the scandal that has come out about Facebook recently, is that depending on the kinds of things you upload, and you might be uploading them or commenting on things in a somewhat innocent manner. Let's say you disagree with a mask mandate at your local school or something, and you have your own reasons for it, but Facebook is going to read that perhaps as, hey, you might like these other pages. And what they're going to give you is just this nice cornucopia of, QAnon conspiracy theories, anti-vax conspiracy theories, perhaps some, political things, just because you made a comment that you think that mask mandates at your local school or whatever might need to be thought about a little bit more or something like that. So your engagement creates more possibilities for engagement that Facebook then throws out at you, according to the mysterious algorithm. So that's one interesting issue, the whole idea of how what you do as a user impacts how Facebook understands you as a user. Um, and how this can, and we'll get to this later, I think next week, how does this affect you, or how you understand who you are, right? Is this kind of interaction with Facebook, with the technology itself, changing how we view ourselves? And I think that some of the, at least empirical data of the last 5 or 6 years seems to indicate that it is having some kind of impact. The second issue here, the concept of the algorithm's impact on social interaction. Again, Trottier, at least in 2014, sort of downplays this a little bit, I think, in favor of the user content element. But as we now know, I think the algorithm does have a pretty important impact on even how we use the product, right? So he's dismissing this power a little bit, dismissing the power of the algorithm on dismissing its social impact. And again, this can be, the social impact can be how you're behaving online, but also how you're behaving offline. And the big question that we've been asking is, how do these two things sort of relate to each other? So one question, though, is this dismissal correct? Well, fast forward 4 years after he wrote this article to 2018, and you have one of the preeminent sort of Facebook critics, Siva Vaidyanathan, who is being interviewed here in this Washington Post article, but he also wrote a book on Facebook. So he has this interesting quote, and I've kind of highlighted the interesting parts. Facebook is in the social engineering business, he says. It constantly tries to manipulate our experience and thus our perspective on our friends, issues, and the world. It does so haphazardly and incoherently, it seems at first. But in fact, there is a coherent driving force. Facebook wants to maximize something close to happiness. It has fallen under the sway of those who believe one can measure affective states and make changes that increase satisfaction or joy. He actually goes on in this quote to discuss some philosophy, right? Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham had this calculus that you could figure out how to increase happiness by, certain increasing and decreasing certain features of a possible action. And so from there, from the idea that you can sort of quantify happiness, Vaidyanathan is saying that's kind of the business that Facebook is in. And they're doing that, of course, through your actual engagement. This algorithm mathematizes essentially what you're doing online, including, as I've mentioned, how long you're staring at a picture, right? Which is kind of creepy if you think about it in two ways. If you're staring at a picture for very long, that's kind of creepy. But worse, I think, of course, is this sort of big brother element of Facebook watching you, right? It's like when we get to 1984, these two-way telescreens, right? They're watching you watch them in a sense, and they're recording it as data that they use. So that algorithm, contrary, I think, to what Trottier is at least hinting at in the previous quote, is really important, especially if we want to understand how or what the impact of all of our social engagement because of Facebook ends up looking like, right? Is Facebook having not only an impact on our online social engagement, but how are we taking this out to the streets, out in the real world? What's been the big phenomenon over the last couple of years or whatever, the whole Karen phenomenon?
Yeah.
Right. So, you're going to the grocery store and you're picking a fight with somebody because they're wearing a mask. Well, what business of it, why do you care? Well, has social media use and sort of the entrenchment into it affected our lives at the grocery store? And is it being made worse by the fact that this stuff is even being posted and people are sort of, getting off on it? we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. It's pretty interesting. And again, you didn't have this in 2014. You barely had it in 2018 when Vaidyanathan is talking about this stuff. 2021 seems to be a bit of a different story. So insofar as Facebook's algorithm does, in some sense, manipulate us, as Vaidyanathan was saying, right? Our experiences, our perspectives, perhaps your perspective on your friends has changed now that you are, quote unquote, friends with them on Facebook. Why would it change? Because of the pictures that they're posting or the comments that they're making. Say you're friends in real life, as it were, and they're posting pictures that are only positive, only reflect positively on them. And you know the real person, quote unquote, right? Well, that might impact how you view that person, right? They're being inauthentic online or something like that. But insofar as this does manipulate us, this can, again, have these kinds of real world impacts, I believe. So one of the questions that we've kind of brought up a few times is how much sort of reciprocal influence there is on our identities through social media use, right? It's the whole idea of how much our online selves, right, these versions of ourselves, at least that we put online, starts to impact how we see ourselves offline. So, I mean, there are stories, for example, about what are they called? Influencers or whatever, who have gotten so entrenched in their influencer identity that it sort of spills over into their real lives, right? And that's just who they become. And I think in one instance, I completely forgot, the story or whatever, or who this was. Don't really follow influencers, so I don't know. But she had to stop doing her, YouTube channel or whatever, because she felt lost. She felt like she was getting lost in this influencer identity. And so she just had to break free from it. So there is that interesting insight that people can have about the distinction between what you take yourself to be, the real you, and this online version of you. But the question is, what does this feedback loop, if there is one, what does it kind of look like, right? So we've had this discussion about the offline self, which somebody like Turkle, I believe, is going to, take to be the authentic self, and these different online selves that we have, which, again, they can be spread across lots of different social media platforms. And if they are, typically speaking, it's going to be different shards of the offline self, right? Different versions of you that you're presenting in different contexts, right? You might use Facebook for one kind of context. You might use Twitter for a different one, Instagram or whatever else for still others, right? So the question is, how do these two versions of the self, offline and online, influence each other, right? Is there a sort of real self in the middle of this that we can actually get to?
There's a quick question from Blake. Is it that social media caused more erratic behavior, or is social media, has it allowed the documentation of the erratic behavior?
Well, yeah, that's exactly, I think, one of the interesting questions, right? So is social media, that's the question I think that we want to be examining. Has social media actually sort of created this in some sense, or at least exacerbated it, allowed it to grow? Or is it really just exposing, how terrible human beings are anyway? And I think that there's a little bit of both, actually. And I think that these arrows, these circles, this circle created by these arrows kind of gets to that. It's difficult, of course, to see how much of one versus how much of the other. But it seems, at least if you look kind of at how things are going, say, on the news or whatever, I think that it's probably there is this feedback loop. It's doing both in a sense, right? People are bad. Social media is making them worse, which then makes them worse, in the offline world, which then, just kind of keeps going around and around. And that seems to be the danger in a sense, right? But yeah, that's exactly the kind of question we want to talk about. Any others?
I think that's it for right now.
All right. So Trottier, as I mentioned earlier, he does seem to kind of pull back a little bit from his dismissal of the algorithm. But again, 2014, the algorithm wasn't in the news, at least as much as it is now. Probably because it wasn't doing as nefarious things as we know it to be doing right now. That's a big guess, but maybe it was, and we just, again, didn't know about it. So he says, this development of Facebook, he's talking in this section about sort of the evolution of Facebook, how it started out as hot or not kind of website, where you can basically, kind of disgustingly rate your students and how hot they are. Started as that, then more of a sort of social interaction for colleges, started at Harvard, soon spread to major colleges and then minor colleges. And then it opened up to everybody, I think, in 2006. And of course, it's expanded out from there. But that kind of development, Trottier is saying, he says it suggests that Facebook's administrators deliberately repurpose users' personal details such that unanticipated exposure is a common outcome. So this is, in a sense, what the algorithm is doing, right? It's taking your input, getting what it can from it as much as possible, and essentially creating this version of you. And then what it does is it sort of manipulates your news feed. So the algorithm actually is partially responsible for what you're seeing on your news feed. So it is partially responsible for the kind of engagement that you can have, right? So the kind of engagement that you can have is the kind of engagement Facebook thinks that you should be having. Again, based on your activity, right? If you like certain things, if you click on a certain kind of advertisement for, say, a briefcase or whatever, it's going to interpret that, and then it's going to change things up a little bit. So he is acknowledging that the algorithm does have this impact. Again, in 2014, the impact, I think, was not as great, of course, as it is now. But the weird thing is, we all know about the algorithm, but Facebook, if you've been reading the news at all lately, they're still in denial mode, right? We didn't do anything bad. We're perfect, blah, blah, blah. Note also this sort of tenor-esque element going on in this quote, right? The unanticipated exposure that one can endure when they're using different social media platforms, right? This is going to get to the idea of stigma a little bit later. And this becomes sort of you can think of this even as a kind of Frankenstein effect, right? He says a user's reputation is often beyond their immediate control. And so this issue of control is, of course, an important one, an important issue in all social media platforms, right? So what issue is that? It's essentially the issue of privacy. So the question is, what measures can be taken to sort of shield yourself, I guess, as much as you can from how the algorithm interprets or takes in your data. Because again, engagement is that process through which the algorithm kind of processes you. But engagement is in some sense under your control, because if you have certain privacy settings, you're not allowing, say, the general public to click on or take or view or link to your pictures, that kind of thing. Or you can control who sees your comments, et cetera, et cetera. So privacy issues are part of this element. The problem, though, is default settings on platforms like Facebook or Twitter essentially opt for mass engagement. Um, of course, that's because they want you to be engaged, right? Um, as much as possible. In fact, they want you to be engaged, especially Facebook, to be engaged as much as possible, because that's how they make their money, right? By getting the data, gleaning or sort of draining the data out of your posts and engagement so they can repackage it for third parties. Now, some of this can be good, right? If you kind of stick to the default settings, it's, for example, easier to build an audience. Why is this? Because more people will be able to have interactions with you, including people you don't know, etc. It's a much wider net if you stick to the default settings. I put this under the good list, just because that's kind of what these media companies, these social media companies themselves, how they would interpret this. But of course, you can also see how this might be not so good. But again, if you're sticking to the default privacy settings, the engagement, the possible engagement that you can have is much wider, right? So if you stick to the privacy settings, and for example, on Twitter, you're not blocking people left and right, it's going to be a lot easier for you to probably build this audience and engage with people, just because everybody will be able to follow you. You'll be able to follow everybody else, unless they block you, of course. But the net is cast much wider if you kind of stick to these. And that's, of course, exactly what these companies want. It also makes, quote unquote, friending people easier, especially, friending people that you don't know, right? You get a friend request, whatever, you don't know this person. Sometimes you can maybe check into them a little bit and see, well, should I accept this friend request, right? So for just a couple of examples from my own life, I'm friends, I think, with my cousin in San Diego on Facebook, for example. But, a year later, I'll get another friend request from the same person who doesn't have a picture uploaded. And that's obviously a clue that somebody has either hacked this person's thing, or they're doing some other nefarious activities and using this identity to friend me again, or to make it look like they're friending me again, right? In fact, in at least two occasions, I have been friends with somebody who really did have two Facebook profiles, and I was like friends with both of them, and I don't know why. It's very strange. Another example, though, is not too long ago, somebody friended me, and I had no idea who this person was, and I looked to see who her friends were. And we had one mutual friend. And so I said, yeah, sure, I guess. Sounds like she might be from the old rock and roll days or whatever. So I did, and we engaged in, a lot of email conversations, and it was very strange because I'm like, who the hell is this person? Why does this person want to have any of these? And they were like weird discussions about books and things. So it's very kind of strange. There's really no way for me to check to see if this is even a real person, right? So, our friends Electric, right? Quoting a famous famous pop song from 40 some odd years ago, right? Gary Newman, he has a song, Our Friends Electric. He's talking about androids, like from Blade Runner, that kind of thing. Wants to know if these people are real. He's thinking about this science fiction stuff in 1979. How appropriate today, because it's not Blade Runner. We're not talking to Sean Young, as we talked about last time, who looks like a real person, but we are talking through a social media platform to somebody who ostensibly is real. You've checked, you have a mutual friend in common. How do you know that the mutual friend that you have in common that you do know from real life wasn't also duped by this quote unquote friend who may or may not be real. These are issues, right? These are real, serious issues. So our friends electric, some of them are probably, right? Our followers on Twitter electric? Yeah, some of them are. You're probably following some bots. Bots are probably following you. You're probably engaging with bots on Facebook, right? Troll elements, troll factories, troll farms, whatever they're called, send out these sorts of things, and they make realistic sounding comments that you're engaging with. What's the common thing to say to a comment that you don't like? You just call them a bot, right? Whether they are or not. It's so ubiquitous now that people just assume that the people that they're engaging with are bots, just if they don't like them or if they disagree with them or whatever. So it's a interesting world that we're creating for ourselves here, I think. So these are the quote unquote good elements of sticking to the default platform privacy settings on these different platforms. Good in quotes, I suppose. What are the bad ones? Well, they're a little bit, I think, more obvious. If you do stick to the default privacy settings, you're essentially allowing others much wider access to your information, right? Again, if you're Facebook, this is the kind of thing that you want. Wider access means potentially more engagement. But of course, with wider access, if people you don't know, or just the general public, even people who aren't your friends, if they have access to your to all of your Facebook posts or whatever, there's this potential to make this information available in other media, on other platforms. Right. So on Facebook, what's the icon? It's the little globe, right? If you have a picture, for example, that has a little globe icon, I think that basically means that anybody can look at it or access it or do whatever, maybe even comment on it, unless that's a separate setting, right? But anytime you see that little globe, that means that, your posts are open to everybody. They have that access. Now, this can take a lot of different forms, of course. People can take your photos from Facebook and post them in different platforms, right? So they can just simply download the photo and put it on Twitter, or, and that can be pretty psychologically damaging, I think, to some people. So, for example, if your actual friend, downloads a picture from Facebook and then posts it on their Twitter feed, let's say they have a lot of followers, and say, hey, look at this idiot, look what they're doing. Unbeknownst to you, right? That is somehow damaging, even though you don't know it, right? Your reputation is in some sense potentially harmed if they're doing that kind of thing. It's not just Facebook, though, right? Taking photos from any platform and posting them on any other platform. Even worse, just hacking into people's phones, obviously, taking their photos from there and then posting them on, say, 4chan. There's been a lot of that kind of, disturbing activity in the last 10 or so plus years. So these are privacy issues. And of course, they're related to this idea of stigma that that Trottier is talking about. And I do want to come back to that, especially at the end a little bit. So there are some interesting caveats that Trottier brings up that might, again, be a little dated here. These are ways of thinking about social media. And the caveat is just the idea that withholding blame, I guess, withholding your blame on social media for some of these bad things, and maybe taking a more critical stance. Again, this is 2014. So he says, number one, not everybody uses Facebook, not everybody uses smartphones, and other hardware technology and social media platforms, right? So not everybody's using this. Therefore, we might want to step back and ask ourselves, what really is the social impact of these kinds of things? Well, in 2021, this is still true, but the power of these technologies still sort of affects even those who don't use them. And he does mention this a little bit. I think that that's even more powerful, however, in 2021. Just look at some of the political issues over the last few years, not just in America, but all over the place, right? How has social media affected how politics even operates, how people operate in the world? Again, go to the grocery store, you might get yelled at. That's new. Go to a school board meeting. Somebody might violently yell at you just for like, we're doing like lunch budget here, son. Not, we're not doing critical race theory. We're talking about the lunchroom budget. But again, it's spilling over into our real world. Other examples, things like revenge porn, right? That's obviously a serious problem. But Trottier even mentions this website, People of Walmart, right? What is that? Well, you go to Walmart with your camera and you take these sort of furtive pictures of people looking ridiculous, I guess. And then you post it to this website. They didn't ask to do that. They didn't give you permission to do that kind of thing. In fact, I was scrolling Twitter recently and I saw this, how Twitter has all these like clickbaity weird things. Well, I clicked on this thing and lo and behold, it was a Walmart thing. And lo and behold, most of the pictures that they had came from this website, peopleofwalmart.com. I don't even know if that's a real website anymore, but the pictures that this other clickbait thing was using were from that website, maybe 10 years ago or whatever. So I think that the impact actually is greater, even for people who don't use this technology than Trottier was mentioning in 2014. Second caveat, digital media use is not sufficient for digital stigma. In other words, if you use digital media, that doesn't guarantee or mean that you're going to experience any sort of digital stigma. Now, this is true, but another problem here, going back to the privacy settings issue, is that you really do have to be vigilant if you want to, not only if you want to set your privacy settings correctly or in the appropriate way for your own use of Facebook, but just getting to those privacy settings in the first place, you have to be somewhat vigilant about this. Why is this? Well, Facebook is essentially constantly changing not only the privacy settings themselves, but where they're located in the Facebook, labyrinth, as it were, itself, right? So the access itself becomes labyrinthine and almost Kafkaesque, right? Kafkaesque means doing a whole bunch of pointless things that don't seem to get you anywhere, right? It's a labyrinth essentially. Trying to get to those Facebook or those privacy settings. They change where you're supposed to click, it seems every, 6 months or every year or something. So instead of having a button that says privacy settings, you have to click on other things, general settings, and then you have to click on some subcategory and then some other category. Finally, you'll get to your privacy settings, but only some of them are there. Others are in a different place, et cetera, et cetera. It's like this weird maze or labyrinth trying to just set your basic privacy settings, which again, they also change every once in a while. Not easy. You have to be a power user, I guess, to really kind of keep up with this stuff. Third caveat, there's a variation with how people cope with stigma. What this means is, I guess, depending on your personality, you're going to deal with the online shaming campaigns against you in different ways. Yes, of course, obviously. This is true. But as he himself notes, it may be that social media use, your actual use of these platforms, is in some sense changing our attitudes about what even counts as different stigmas, right? So it's interesting, I think, that, of course, the kind of person you are is going to affect how you deal with potential stigma that you experience from different online posts or whatever. But is the actual use of, say, Facebook or Twitter or Instagram changing how we understand stigma? And we're going to get back to this a little bit later, because I think that that's one of the most interesting aspects of understanding how social media impacts us. Because the question there is, how is social media use sort of changing us cognitively? And this might be one of those ways. All right, so we're going to look at stigma now, this Goffman guy. If anyone has any questions before we do that, just shoot them out. Out. No questions?
No questions.
All right, Goffman. Apparently Goffman is a sociologist, 20th century sociologist, writing mostly in, I guess, the mid 20th century. Trottier is using him because of his studies on different aspects of social interaction. And what he means by this is how we exchange, information with each other, and how these exchanges contribute to or even contest our social reality. So what's interesting about this this aspect, I think, of Trottier's article is something that we've already mentioned a few times, namely, human beings are social creatures. We're doing the kind of stuff online, in a sense, that we've done from the beginning, right? From always. So getting back to a student's earlier question, how much is social media use sort of changing us versus exposing what we already do in a sort of amplified way? Well, again, I think it's a little bit both, but Goffman's analysis points to the idea that we've always done kind of some of the stuff that we, find ourselves doing online anyway. It's, of course, just not been amplified. We've discussed this already a little bit with Turkle, right? People in the 1800s put calling cards out. That's kind of like, social media use, but much slower. But he has what he calls this dramaturgical framework, right? Social interactions are, in a sense, like theatrical performances, right? We've talked about this as well. How much of this kind of stuff do you do offline? Before the internet was this big thing, before, social media even existed, say in 1994, how would you navigate your social world? Well, in some ways, you're navigating it in the way that you navigate social media. You put on a different face, right? So just from my own experience, right? You have different sets of friends, right? Couple of friends over here, you are one kind of person. With your other friends over here, you're a different kind of person. What would happen if these two different groups met? It's like the what is it, the Bizarro Jerry episode of Seinfeld, where Elaine finds herself with three friends who are very much like Jerry, George, and Kramer, but they're sort of the opposite. They look similar, but they're actually sort of deep and nice people, not selfish, superficial people. And then there's a great scene in this episode where they're all walking down the street and the two groups kind of meet, and comedy ensues or whatever. But you kind of put on a different face for the different kind of groups that you're dealing with, not just online, but in real life. Right? So, you're going to act differently at the Thanksgiving table, I imagine, than how you do when your friend calls and says, hey, do you want to go to a movie after you get done with your Thanksgiving stuff? And you say, yes, I do. it's almost as if, there's a weight off your shoulder. You can go to the movies, you can, breathe a little easier, perhaps, that sort of thing, right? It's the same kind of phenomenon. And he introduces this interesting distinction, right? The front stage and the backstage, right? The front stage is where we do put on different masks. We put on different faces, right? Just the upturned and the downturned theatrical mask icons. Depending on what the context is, depending on what group you're with, you're going to put on a different face. But again, there's this backstage where you can sort of suspend this performance, right? We even have this, you can even think of this as in the Thanksgiving example. You're putting on a kind of performance at the dinner table, for example, because you don't want to offend your aunt or you don't want to offend your grandma. Your grandma thinks you're the sweetest thing. She, pinches your cheeks, whatever. Then you go off with your friends. You can let down your guard a little bit, smoke a cigarette, whatever. Grandma doesn't know that you smoke cigarettes, but this is the quote unquote real you. That's the idea. Now, the question, of course, is social media, in a sense, blurring this distinction? And one reason to think that it might be, and we'll talk about this on the next slide a little bit, is that it's kind of difficult to separate this social media understanding of ourselves and ourselves, right? Again, that gets back to that circle, that feedback loop. How much of that is actually going on now versus, say, in 1994? Obviously, when there wasn't social media, but has the technology sort of blurred this line even more than it was if there was such this kind of distinction 30 years ago? Part of this issue is the concept of the audience, right? Now, we've talked about this a little bit before in other contexts. We seem to require an audience, right? Go back to Turkle. We require an audience for a sense of validation, right? You put yourself out there, you text other people, you expect them to text back. Sometimes we start to understand ourselves and maybe even create our parts of our identity through what these other people give us feedback on, right? So it's identity creation and validation at the same time. But on the other side of that, of course, we are also other people's audiences. So if everybody's using social media, you have to think about the audience performer relationship from all these different sides, right? So Trottier says, terms such as role and performance might give the impression that dramaturgy is focused on surface level displays. Yet for Goffman, these performances are fundamental to social functioning and for individuals to fit in their social context. So again, Goffman, writing in the mid 20th century or so, doesn't have social media. So the question is, what is social media's impact on this kind of dramaturgical framework element, right? Does social media, against Goffman's idea here, maybe even against Trottier's idea, does social media force a sort of surface level performance? Does it require that kind of thing? And again, this is exactly something Turkle talked about in that second article that we read. Now, the question then is this especially the case if all social context in 2021, for example, or at least the vast majority of it, is being informed so thoroughly by social media? In other words, since the vast majority of people are at least in some way connected to social media, and they're connected so immediately through their smartphones, is our on and offline social performances, are they now more or less just surface level performances? Is that, in other words, having an impact more generally? I think that's an interesting question. Again, it's back to that question of what does social media use, or what impact is it having on our psychology, our cognition, the way we think, right? So I'm just going to go back now to another quote from Siva Vaidyanathan from that same interview. You don't have to write this down, obviously. In fact, you can look this up. I've given the information down at the bottom if you want to read the whole article. But he says, from Facebook's point of view, users shouldn't know all the ways that Facebook uses and distributes their basic data and records of interactions for two reasons. One, it's just too vast a collection of users, right? Billions of users, and actually the algorithm itself is super complex. Secondly, users might get turned off if their experience on the surface of Facebook, all the likes, clicks, videos, comments, messages, etc., if that experience on the surface is interrupted by the reality of what's behind the wizard's curtain, right? Going back to the appearances versus reality element that that Plato introduced us to. So Facebook keeps assuring us that we have control. We have control of all of this information that we're putting up there. But that's only limited to superficial control over the audiences within Facebook to which we share posts. Add to that, of course, if you're using default privacy settings, the audience is not just within Facebook, it's everywhere, it's everybody. So this kind of brings us now to finally, I guess, to the idea of stigma, which we've kind of been talking about anyway. What is stigma? Well, in the article, it's personal information that can damage a person's performance and their reputation, right? And he gives us three different kinds. Abominations of the body, blemishes of character, and tribal stigma. So the first one, if you're posting something online, which isn't a particularly flattering picture of you, you might have a reputation. You might have your reputation ruined if it's being shared and, put on peopleofwalmart.com or whatever, something like that. Blemishes of character. You're posting pictures of your drunken party or other bad things that you've done, or you get overly angry in a comment section or something like that. Perhaps we've all done that a little bit. Tribal stigma. This is something that's also going to come up a little bit more later in the course. Stigmas that you can have within and among these different tribes that you belong to, right? Different social groups. So the privacy issues here, the ways of withholding information arise with these different kinds of stigmas, right? Some of these stigmas may or may not arise based on how vigilant you are with your privacy settings. So Trottier says, despite the benefits of living in public online, users require the right to withhold personal information. Now, I think that this is an interesting quote, an interesting thing that he's saying here. Because if we go back to what Vaidyanathan has been saying in a couple of these quotes, if he's right, if Vaidyanathan is right about only an appearance of control on Facebook, right? You've got your privacy settings, you click a few things. Does Facebook really care that you're clicking on that? Or really, is it the algorithm that's in control ultimately? If he's right about only this appearance of control, is Facebook violating what Trottier here is pretty strongly calling a right regarding stigma, right? We have this right to withhold personal information. And B, our ability to interact in proper social ways. So if Facebook's algorithm, coupled with their sort of, surface level privacy settings, are they violating our rights regarding what information we actually are allowed to withhold? And are they also sort of impacting our ability to interact in proper social ways? Proper being something like you actually do have control over it. Well, if you don't have control over it, then the ability to act socially seems to be impacted. And it's because our quote unquote rights to withhold certain information is also being violated. So that's, I think, interesting. Trottier is bringing up the concept of rights in terms of being able to withhold personal information. And Vaidyanathan is saying, well, Facebook essentially isn't allowing us to do that. They really are below the surface, manipulating us in certain ways. All right, so moving on to the concept of stigma and digital stigma. This is kind of where some of the issues Trottier has been talking about sort of move forward, I guess, into 2021. Again, I think things have changed a little bit. I think that social media, its expanse, and just the changes to it itself, how it is, how it operates, have had some sort of cognitive impact, maybe a social cognitive impact, right, over the last, say, 10 years or so. So the issue here is, how are these spoiled identities online different from how they might operate in the real world? So he says, look, spoiled identities that you have in your farm community or whatever might actually be easier to repair in the real world, right? Why? Well, you can move to the next community, for example. Maybe not in the rural America, because communities tend to be linked in various ways. But you can move to the big city. You can get lost in the big city, perhaps, if you can afford it. Nobody can afford to move to New York City anymore if you're a regular person, so maybe choose a different city. The idea is, it seems to be easier to be able to walk away from a spoiled identity if it's created sort of in the real world. At least that's the idea. So going back to this Solov person, as social reputation shaping practices, things like gossip and shaming, right, as these sorts of things migrate to the internet, they are being transformed in significant ways. So he's saying the internet itself is changing the very nature, in some sense, or the very application of these offline, real world reputation shaping practices, things like gossip and shaming, right? Information that was once scattered, forgettable, and localized, right? Rumor mill in your local town, whatever. That's becoming permanent and searchable, right? You put this stuff online, it's stored somewhere, right? What's the refrain that we all hear? Probably since you're younger, you've heard it since you were a kid. Once it's online, it's there forever, right? And this is what police and parents use to discourage kids from like sexting or whatever it was. There was a big craze a few years ago, apparently. Put it online, it's there forever. So it's a different kind of reputation shaping practice that's going on these days. So one issue to think about in connection to some of the stuff that I've been talking about is social media makes it more difficult to get away from these shameful posts. Again, you put it up, it's quote unquote there forever. But the interesting question, I think, is, does the use of social media, or has it in the last, say, 10 years or so, just its ubiquity, i.e. it's everywhere, and its infiltration in all aspects of life? You go to Meijer with your cell phone on, by the way, they're tracking what aisles you're going down. And if you go to Meijer and you go down the coffee pot aisle and you go home and you log into Facebook and you see ads for coffee pots, that's why. Right? It's infiltrating even your shopping experience at Meijer. Does the use of social media, because of these sorts of things, make us, in some sense, care less about these shaming practices? Does it make us care less about privacy itself? Has it changed our attitude towards these things in such a way that now people are basically yeah, I guess that's the world we live in now. What are you going to do? Right? You're trading off, of course, something like convenience for privacy. What impact has that had on how we view ourselves as well? Even things like our attention spans, right? And this is an interesting aspect here, going back to Trottier's point. What's his point? it's possible that, well, even Solov, right? You put this stuff online, it's going to always be there. But what we've seen, I think, in the last few years or so is some big scandal happens, and then literally the next day, it's just like, what scandal? We're on to the next thing, right? And, has social media kind of impacted that psychological element? It's pretty interesting. All right, I want to give what I'm going to call a tale of two stigmas. One of these comes from the articles. The other one is a little bit more recent because, of course, he was writing in 2014, not in 2021. So let's call the first one the 2011 Vancouver Riots, right? What happened here? Well, general violence, right? General violence broke out in the streets after a hockey game. It's not unlike the couch burning that you're going to see next week when Michigan State plays Michigan, right? If we win, if we lose, some couch is going to be burned. You can guarantee it. East Lansing, right? There was a lot of looting, different clothing stores. He mentions one woman who was, shamed, as it were, for doing this kind of thing, for looting, setting fire to police vehicles. I think this actually happened in East Lansing once, or at least some vehicle. Here's the thing. Photos of all of this were posted on Facebook, and I italicize were posted for a reason. It's to contrast this with the second tale of two stigmas. So people were taking pictures of this general violence, this riot, and posting them on Facebook. Several of the participants were identified and underwent online harassment, right? They suffered what we might call short-term stigma, right? How dare you do this kind of thing, blah, blah, blah. And possibly long-term stigma as well. We don't know because Trottier didn't follow up a few years later, as far as we know. The basic aftermath is something that you might expect, right? Criminal justice outcomes, people probably went to jail, people probably had to pay fines, and of course, some social stigma because of posts online. So this is a standard kind of riot, and it's a standard kind of riot's relation to social media that you would have seen 10 years ago. Things seem to be a little different now. So here's the second tale. 2021 January 6 riots at the U.S. Capitol. What happened here? Well, it was the outgrowth of a political rally that was going on, somewhat nearby. And violence erupted when these people penetrated the Capitol building, even a little bit before that. The violence itself was accompanied with different political banners, other things like flags of all sorts, American flags, group identification through clothing. So people wore different, outfits or whatever. Death happened. I don't know if death happened in 2011, but here, as we all know, death happened on the day, but some other deaths happened afterwards in various ways. Suicide, health issues, etc. Rioters themselves, as opposed to the 2011 riot, posted their own photos on different social media platforms. And several participants were identified, not by other online users, but that was happening, but also by the FBI, right? Who the FBI was looking at in the 2011 one, or not the FBI, but the police were looking at Facebook, for example. Here, the FBI was also penetrating the social media sites that these people were posting this stuff on themselves. Oh, drawing things. That's interesting. How did that happen?
The annotation feature.
Did I accidentally click on something?
Yeah. So if you go to your view, it should say you are viewing someone's screen, Jason Patrick Mask's screen, then go to view options. And then there's a annotate thing. If you uncheck it, you should be good.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was from PowerPoint itself.
Oh, okay.
So wait. There's no way to turn it off.
One moment.
Wait. Nope. I don't have to use this. I mean, I can just use the buttons, hopefully. I'll just try this. There's only a couple slides left.
Okay.
So the aftermath of this was, people awaiting trial, as we all know from the news. Some of these people expressed regret. Some people said that they were temporarily insane. Other people don't express any sort of regret. And many of them are being treated as sort of martyrs or political heroes, right? A different kind of outcome and aftermath than 2011. Jeez, this is really weird. So one question is, has the evolution of social media technology played a role in the differences between, on the one hand, how these riots played out, and on the other hand, the responses to these two riots? So just how they played out, just a comparison. The Vancouver riots weren't really a planned event through Facebook. It's more spontaneous after a sporting event. But as we found out, and Facebook's is, still denying this, the Capitol riots were a planned event through that platform. Right. Regarding the second one, the responses to the two riots, the Vancouver riots carried stigma with them because other people posted photos on Facebook and other platforms. The Capitol riots also, again, had some stigma, again, as regret, but also this historic narrative, right? The users themselves were filming themselves and posting these videos and photos on different social media platforms. So one question is, where did this mentality that it's a good thing to post your violence to social media, where exactly has this come from? And my suggestion is that these attitudes are actually changing, right? There is something going on because of social media use. So I'm suggesting here that the world of 2011 is somehow different from the one in 2021. Jeez, that's really weird. And that's only 10 years, right? And in fact, Trottier at the very end of these two articles kind of suggests something similar, it seems. So here's a long quote. Again, you don't have to write this down. This is on page 99. While the tone of these shows, and he's discussing shows like What Not to Wear, while the tone of these shows is rehabilitative, viewers are invited to enjoy the humiliation that participants experience. An immediate reaction may be to dismiss the quality and relevance of these programs. Yet this assessment overlooks the fact that embarrassment is normalized en masse and social media. Perhaps we are witnessing an emerging post-shame culture where digital media users are immune to formally stigmatizing attributes, or perhaps participants are simply willing to embarrass themselves in exchange for the fame that is contained within infamy. And here's a good example of what we in logic call an inclusive or. Right. So, yes, I think that is at least something that's happening, right? We are witnessing an emerging post-shame culture where digital media users are immune to formally stigmatizing attributes. Why is this? Well, one explanation is we're just using it more. There's something about our continued and ever-growing use of social media that is in some sense psychologically allowing us to think that we are immune to certain stigmatizing attributes. And in that respect, well, for all intents and purposes, we are immune from them. And yes, perhaps participants are simply willing to embarrass themselves in exchange for the fame that is contained within infamy. I think that's also something that's going on, right? The idea of instant YouTube fame, et cetera, is having an impact on people's behaviors, some of which they record and put online so that they can get fame. The weirder and crazier it is, the more clicks, the more views, the more likes, whatever you're going to get. So I think that there is this kind of impact.